Welcome to our first lecture series of Harbinger. What we're trying to do with this series is bring two different practices together, meaning art and science. We were thinking of bringing them together in a conversation, seeing how they would intersect with each other, where those two practices would converge. I myself am researching this at the moment at the VUB, at a research group called CLEA, the Center for Leo Apostel. We're an interdisciplinary research group who brings a lot of different disciplines together, usually in science, but now we're also branching out into art and science. Most of all, this series is about bringing people together, about starting a conversation and seeing where we end up. To that effect, today we have two curators as our guest speakers. First of all, we've got Marjan, who is the director of the forthcoming Ghent University Museum. She's trained as a scientist, and she's also collaborated with artists such as Vanderlinden van Breukeren and Sarah van Acht. Currently, she's designing the new museum, and she's been focusing on the intersections of science and art through the idea of experience. And then as a second, we've got Barbara Vanderlinden. She's an art critic, an editor, and a curator, and among many other projects, she's curated the Laboratorium exhibition together with Hans Ulrich Orbist. Now, first of all, I'd like to introduce Marjan to give a lecture about her museum.
Thank you for the introduction. So yes, I'm going to give a talk about my work. But first, I want to give some more background, maybe, the context where I'm coming from, because I'm currently the director of a new museum that's opening next year. But by training, I am a scientist, and more specifically, I am a veterinarian. And I did my research in anatomy. So I dissected a lot of animals, very small, very large. And through working as a researcher on anatomy, I met a lot of artists, among which Vanderlinden de Breukeren. And actually meeting artists and talking about my work as a researcher and meeting their perspective on my study object, it opened my view, the way I looked at my study objects, in such a way that it changed me. I no longer looked at animals or dead animals merely as things to be cut in or do research on just the anatomy, but they made me look at it with a different perspective. So it changed my experience in science, and it made me want to share that experience with other people. And I found exhibitions to be a perfect medium to do so, to share that kind of experience, how I looked at science more as an experience than just merely collecting data and finding hypotheses. So meeting artists during my research has changed me. I first want to go through the permanent display of the new museum, the new science museum that is opening in March 2020, and how we have approached that curating. We've also collaborated in the permanent display with some artists, and I want to maybe talk a little bit why we chose to collaborate with artists in a permanent display of a science museum. I will then talk you through some past temporary exhibitions and why we chose there to work with artists, sorry. So we're opening in the Campus Ledegang, which is the Faculty of Sciences, in the Botanical Garden. Actually, in this summer, we're also collaborating with the curatorial studies to make an exhibition on the CERN project in the Botanical Garden. And this new science museum, well, every museum starts with collection. So what kind of collections do we hold? It's a very large collection. We're talking about roughly 400,000 objects, so it's large, but also very diverse. It's diverse in the disciplines it presents, going from ethnographic collections, anatomy, zoology, history of science, history of medicine, mathematical models, as you can see. So it's very diverse in the disciplines that they present. So let's say 7 years ago, we started from these collections, and they asked us to make a new science museum. And starting from these collections, you could question, okay, what kind of stories can these objects tell you about science? And the classical science museum, what they would do is show these objects on display, and they would mainly focus on the history of these objects and mainly on what kind of research data they produced. So they mainly focus on communicating the output of the scientific data. This is not the approach that we have taken. We started from these collections and the diversity of the collections and the disciplines, and we saw it as a strength. So juxtaposing these different disciplines also allows you to take more of a meta-perspective view to look at science and the scientific process. So by juxtaposing, let's say, an ethnographic collection with history of medicine and trying to explain to an audience what they have in common, let's say the main narrative of this museum is focusing more on a meta-perspective view on the scientific process, which is more of a philosophical narrative rather than a historical view on science. So if we want to have more a philosophical approach, we first defined what kind of key messages we wanted to bring across. What is the message that we want to bring across for this audience if they see these objects? Again, we first decided what we did not want to focus on. We're not focusing on the history of the university, and we're not focusing on the history of science. We're focusing on scientific thinking and the scientific process. And we also wanted to, how to say that? Try to discuss some of the very, I'm not finding the right word. Anyway, so the scientific process and scientific thinking. And so first key message is science is a human activity, because how people look at science is often in a very rigid way, and they have pre-assumptions. That's the word I was looking for. So we try to fight some of these pre-assumptions. So science is a human activity. It's not an activity just done by these geniuses who have aha erlebnisses, work alone in a laboratory, and have a white coat, or men and have beards. No, it's a human activity. It comes with a lot of failure. It's a group process. It's a lot of doubt, failure, and working together. Secondly, practicing science means dare to think. Of course, it's not a coincidence that dare to think is the motto of the university, but dare to think is, it's actually coming from Kant. And what we want to say there is that the way that people look at scientists, they often think that scientists think very rigidly, that they think through classification processes, and that they're not able to be creative. Well, a good scientist has to be creative and has to think out of the box. So dare to think is necessary, or it's necessary in a scientific process, or to do science well. So dare to think, important. And science is a dynamic concept. So that means that science is not something that is only done in the universities and behind closed doors, but the practice of science is in a constant dialogue with society. If you look at the science or the data that are now being produced at the Ghent University, or the focus of science has differed throughout the years. Now everybody's focusing on cancer research, for example. 50 years ago, that would have been different. So there's a lot of influence from society to the scientific practice and vice versa. So we have 2 floors in this permanent display, roughly 1,000 square meters. And so we had to choose we chose 800 objects out of these 400,000 objects to give those key messages. As you can see, our scenographer has chosen not to put in walls, so there will be big open spaces. And what I wanted to show you is that we chose, through these 2 levels, 8 teams, and so the audience will walk through the 8 teams, and then you see so the teams are chaos, twijfel or doubt, model, measurement or meten, and every team is presented by a key selection of objects, let's say, so 8 objects will be shown there every time through all the different disciplines, and that's our main narrative. So what we think, or what we try to achieve, if the audience sees the 8 objects per team, that they will have those key messages. Surrounded by those key objects, you see cabinets, and in those cabinets we will display a lot of objects that will encourage the audience to go and explore themselves. What I also want to show you, that is, so the audience enters over there, and they immediately see a film installation by the artist Sarah van Acht, and I will show a little fragment of a film that we have already made with her, and they were also leaving the museum through an installation of cinematographer Sarah van Acht. So also in the permanent display, we focus on science-art dialogue, and on the level above, where we will show our temporary exhibitions, we will go much deeper into this science-art dialogue. To show you an example how this juxtaposition works, I show you 3 key objects from our team Chaos. The team is called Chaos, but it's talking about why scientists want to classify. What is the reason or the reasoning behind these classification systems? How rigid are they? How much do they change in time? Do they offer some kind of a structure to scientists? And what happens if these structures shift through time? So what you see from the left is a Sinufo mask from West Africa, from the ethnographic collections. And these masks are worn during rituals in which the Sinufo tried to re-establish an order in the chaos. And mainly try to, when they think there's an imbalance between bad and right, or wrong and right, they do these rituals wearing these masks. But through this, we try to tell that the search or the quest from humans to find some kind of order and to have something to hang on to is a very natural and human thing. Next to that, you see the classification of some insects. And actually, these are flies to be found on the body of, or dead bodies. And then they try to tell how long the body has been dead. But what we try to show with this is that every classification system a scientist uses, that it can only be used in that context. Because these flies will only come here in the lowlands, so this classification system won't work in America or in Asia, that's for one. Secondly, it has changed through time. So every classification system a scientist uses can only be used in that context and during that time, and it shifts continuously. And at the right, you see a Beauchesne specimen from Félix Plateau. Félix Plateau is the son of Joseph Plateau, a zoologist. And this kind of preparation technique shows the different elements, the different anatomical elements in, for example, crustacea in this case. But the question that we pose here is, does the scientist find some kind of order, or is the order already present in nature, and do we mainly discover some kind of order? So you can see it's a philosophical approach rather than just giving the scientific data to the audience, and I think it works better by juxtaposing these different disciplines. This is our first and only 3D render of the spaces, so of the new museum. So I talked about the key objects, which you can see on the large tables. So every team will have 8 objects displayed on these large tables, and then surrounded by cabinets that show a lot of objects and will hopefully invite audience to go explore themselves. This approach we have tested during the last couple of years with temporary exhibitions, and I just wanted to show you 2 examples. First, the post-mortem exhibition, which we did in 2015 in the rooms of the forensic pathology opposite the academy at the CASC. And these rooms of forensic pathology were used throughout 200 years. Every body that died through violence in the Ghent area ended up here. And they moved, so the rooms became empty, and it was, well, we saw a very nice opportunity to make an exhibition there. As a science museum, of course, you want to explain what forensic pathology is all about, what anatomy is all about, how do we dissect bodies and so on, and what do we learn through dissecting bodies, and what are the developments in these kind of disciplines. So we talked about that, that's the scientific data. But yeah, you invite people to go through these rooms which have a very emotional atmosphere. There was a lot of violence there, a lot of history. And we also wanted to make them reflect, or the audience reflect on how do we as scientists, as humans, approach these kind of objects, or subjects, sorry. How do we approach bodies? Can we just put aside our human nature and just start cutting in a body? And how do we approach or deal with all this violence? How is science, at that point, our toolbox to collect data objectively and come to a hypothesis of cause of death? So firstly, we also had to change the rooms a bit and turn them into exhibition rooms. And how did we do that? For me, there are 4 elements. Of course, the scenography is important. And for me, one of the key elements there is light. When I make exhibitions and I reserve a budget for the light, people always think I'm a bit crazy, but I think 1/3 of your exhibition should go to lighting the objects. The aesthetic quality, which I think for you guys as artists or curators in art seems very obvious, but also when we curate scientific objects, we want to look at the aesthetic quality of the objects. Letting the audience find the beauty or experience the beauty in the object, the scientific object, is also what you think about when you're curating a show. Not just the object that is telling the exact scientific story that you want to share, but also the beauty and the object is important when you choose an object. We also invited contemporary artists. I will show you their work later. 40 contemporary artists who all made new work. They all visited the spaces before we opened, a year before, and inspired by the places, they all made new work. And program and events, I will come back to that. So here you already see the change of the rooms, I think, and the objects displayed. You see the light has changed a bit, but you can see it better here. So scenography was really important to also lower the threshold for people to enter these spaces, because it's not an easy space to enter, and give them more of a almost poetic experience and a confrontation with mortality and so on. But so to be able to invite people in spaces where they will be confronted with mortality, you have to allow some kind of poetic look and feel. Otherwise, people, why would they come inside, right? So, for example, these pathological specimens that we displayed there, I've chosen specimens that were quite abstract, so not fetuses or anything like that, because that's, again, not very aesthetically appealing, and it's very, for a lot of people, very repulsive. So beautiful objects, more objects that intrigue you, that you want to find the history or the context about. So aesthetically appealing and displayed in a very poetic way. This is some of the works of the contemporary artist, photographer Johan Jacobs, who made the photos in the spaces himself. So they played with the rooms, with the atmosphere, and with the scientific objects that they found there. And again, like we put those different disciplines in the permanent display in juxtaposition, I think putting artistic work next to the scientific objects is yet another juxtaposition that helps the visitor to come to some more of a state of reflection and invites them more to think about what they see. We invited a lot of schools, and the feedback we got from them was really, really good. Well, program and events, why did I put that in? Because what we try to do is send people out with a lot of questions, and for a science museum that's not so evident. We don't give answers, but we pose a lot of questions, and so we let them out with a lot of questions. So what I do think that is important is that you have a well-established program and program of events where you allow your visitors to have some kind of a line of communication with the scientists. They have to be able to pose those questions. There has to be some kind of a platform where contact and communication is possible. So also for the post-mortem exhibition, we had I think every 2 or 3 days there was an event. For example, this was a brain dissection, a comparative brain dissection between man and animal. Again, with a lot of ethical questions coming up, not just this is the anatomy of the brain, but also comparing human and animal, and where do these bodies come from, and are you allowed to cut in humans and in animals, and what is the difference, and so on. But so making a platform where communication is possible, I think is important. The second I wanted to show you was the Out of the Box exhibition that ran in 2017. And what we've shown, among others, there is a fin whale skeleton in the St. Bavo's Cathedral in Ghent. And this is yet another juxtaposition, putting a scientific object in a, sacral place, religious space. So it looks out of context, which again invites the visitor or whoever is looking at it, the viewer, to come more in a reflective state of mind. again, I think the questions that we tried to raise here was the idea of cutting in a whale, or when you meet a whale that has beached, that has beached, it's a very human reaction to be confronted with mortality. We have invited poet Peter Verhelst to write very almost literally a science-art dialogue. So he made a poem on it. I have to finish that now. Can I show Sarah van Acht? Just one. So I've shown you that in the permanent display we work with cinematographer Sarah van Acht, who mainly, when she collaborates with us, starts from a science historical narrative. And previously we have made a film with her on Plempius, a 17th century anatomist, who reconstructed the camera obscura through the dissection of cow eyes. And when I talk to you about making scientific exhibitions more an experience rather than just giving forward data, I think Sarah captures this very well in her films. Now, the sound is not coming through, but I will show you a small fragment of this film. So, of the experiment of Plempius in trying to find out how the image is constructed in the eye. Okay, that's it. And then
So, thank you for inviting me at this very last minute. I'm Barbara Vanderlinden, as I was introduced so kindly, and this is my second talk in a very short time about laboratorium. Here, for some of you, you have already heard this talk. Some of the students of CASC Curatorial Study Program asked me a couple of weeks ago, I believe, to come and speak of this exhibition, which is titled Laboratorium, and which was taking place in 1999 in Antwerp, throughout the city of Antwerp. I'm not going to go in depth really about every detail of this exhibition, but I'm giving this because I hope in our discussion it will be helpful to speak a little bit more about the, hopefully also hear from you what is the current state of the relationship between art and science, and what are the new projects that are coming up. But I'll give you a little insight in what we did in 1999. 1999 was 400 years of the birth of Anton van Dyck in Antwerp, and there was a celebration to be organized around this event, and I was asked to bring an exhibition or develop an exhibition among other things in a program. And I decided to, instead of making a contemporary art exhibition that would explain the relationship eventually from contemporary artists' point of view to Van Dyck, I decided to look at Anton van Dyck's studio rather as a beginning, as a starting point, because In the 16th, 15th century, Antwerp was very renowned for having the most important studio of artists, be it Rubens or Van Dyck, and those were actually schools, and those were actually absolutely research centers at the front of the development of art. So this idea that the situation of art and the relationship between the studio, the place where art is made, has something to do with arts as a place of investigation, but also as this place seemed to have changed across history, through history. The form of the studio had changed from, as I say here, we have this almost institution studios of Van Dyck 400 years ago. At the time when we were thinking of this exhibition in 1999, there were hardly any studios anymore. Artists were just working on their computer. This was the studio, and they were connected in very different ways with their work to producers, to thinkers, to thought, and so on. The condition of the studio definitely is changing throughout history, and we can also see that the condition of the studio actually reflects what kind of art that is made. To give a very simple example, after the post-World War in the United States specifically, a lot of artists started to work in factory buildings, and that affected absolutely the dimension of art. The fact that Barnett Newman was capable of making 6-meter long, panel paintings, and the fact was related to that space. It was obviously not the Montmartre under the roof kind of romantic studio anymore. So this relationship between the studio and the art production and the condition of the artist's work as a researcher was what was was the beginning of this exhibition project Laboratorium, which when we started was not called Laboratorium, we just had a question and decided to develop the exhibition in a pretty similar way as I think science is engaging with certain questions by brainstorming, by inviting other scientists and setting up an investigation. So at the time, Bruno Latour and Peter Gallison were the most advanced in researching a similar question they had developed for the question of the condition of science and its relation to the laboratorium, which also is, if you look through history, a changing through time. So the discussion led us to develop a project that initially was going to be a research around that, and eventually, if we wanted to do the exhibition, we could have done it, but we did it finally. But it wasn't from the outset an obligation to come up with an exhibition, because I guess one of the first key points which Bruno Latour brought up was it's hard to represent the condition of the studio or the condition of the laboratory per se. If you represent it, it's not a laboratory anymore. So there is something with the exhibition as a space of representation and the studio as a place of, simply said, creation or research that doesn't seem to be completely compatible, or there seems to be a contradiction in terms there. So that's why we said, well, maybe it just ends as a research, we don't know. But I think if you will see and look at the exhibition that I will show you, we did it finally across the city of Antwerp in several spaces. As you can see, this was abandoned spaces, but also existing laboratories, as many other cities in the world. Antwerp at that time had about 300 laboratories. In fact, we are not aware that we are pretty much living in a laboratorium. This is a condition that if you see for the city of Antwerp, every day there are sugar and other products coming through the harbor. They have to be tested. Whether sugar is something that has to be scientifically tested, whether that chemically represents or is sugar. So all of these things, we're unaware of how much we live in this laboratorium condition. As Bruno Latour said, when we pin in, our card in a cash withdrawal machine, we add data to a laboratorium. So just to give an idea, from the idea of the, romantic, solo place of an artist or a scientist in the 19th century working in the so-called isolated spaces where only men and some knowledgeable men and class could enter, we in 99 we're in a situation where everything of this is of course dispersed. It's a situation of a condition where you actually cannot speak so much anymore of the inside or outside of a laboratory. Serious scientific research is done in networks across the world. They are connected through the internet. Similarly, artists are working like that. They have the exhibition sites all over the actually planet where they operate their works as a somehow studio condition. So that was the beginning of how to translate this in an exhibition, and the way we did it was basically asking a series of artists to come to Antwerp and occupy a place and do some research, scientists and artists, and have in the photography exhibition museum, which is an image you see here, the so-called, what we called our nervous center of all these researchers at work. So the photography museum was where the pictures arrived of what was going on, was where if we gave a lecture, it was in 24 hours transcribed and put into a book and came out of on the walls. And so in this working office, we decided that the exhibition could only represent the work of the exhibition, like if it was going to be a laboratory, and we're not going to contradict it by transforming it in a representation of it, our office was going to be the center of the exhibition. So this is the center of the exhibition, where you see a mixture of our research on images going on, or other things coming in. Here we are producing the book. Every day when there was something coming in from artists or from activities we organized, such as lectures, they would be immediately transcribed, as I said, or photographs put into pages. The designer in Toronto had designed a structure, if you want, an architecture for the book to develop over time. And so, oops, now the computer doesn't want to continue anymore. So you could see the book unfold all over the exhibition spaces of the photography museum. Parallel to that, we had what was called the Theatre of Proof. Here you see Bruno Latour restaging Pasteur's first experiment, or, discovery of the bacteria. So through the history of science, over 150 years, scientists have at certain points had to go public with what they are doing in order to convince the public, simply sometimes also to get the money and the financing for their research. So that is a really interesting thing that Bruno Latour brought up. This is actually what happens in the exhibition too, is you somehow translate what you do into the laboratory in a presentation. He called it the Theatre of Proof. And we had about 15 experiments throughout history that were shown how specific problems were brought to the... that's not my presentation. What is going on here? Oh, I'm lost. What do I have to do? So that's an image you did not show, no?
No. Sorry.
We have to go through it. Ja, ik zal hier gaan. Oké. So my problem is I don't see very well, So, hoe klik ik daarop nu? Okay, so the Theatre of Proof was a series of public presentations of experiments, but we also asked artists such as Xavier Leroy here, who is a biologist who is specialized in breast cancer. And so he's presenting his research on breast cancer, obviously, as he is a choreographer too. He's actually mingling the language of choreography with this scientific type of presentation. And this was another presentation. This is the first laboratory. Isabel Stengers also participated. I don't know if you know Isabel Stengers, but anyway, she wanted to show what was actually what she called the first laboratory, which was the experiment of Galileo, falling bodies. And so people could actually do these experiments. And then this is another Luc Steels, who was presenting his Talking Heads experiment. He actually worked for 6 months in the city in order to develop one of the stages of his science or laboratory in our exhibition. And this was, for example, contribution by Jason Roth, an artist who lived in LA at the time and who said to us, for me, the studio is actually everything that I see outside of the studio. It's, you know, my view from inside the studio outside. So he sent us this drawing pictogram for his project, which was going to be that on a daily basis he was sending us during 6 months an image from his studio. As his studio was in many places and he was moving all the time, we basically got a kind of catalog of North America and Europe sent back to us as his studio. This is an experiment by Rosemarie Trockel, sleep experiment, and she had done this already she'd done it later at Venice Biennale, but she was very interested in sleep as experimenting with the condition of sleep in different places and contexts where sleep normally doesn't happen or can occur, and developing some kind of cocoon, so which would allow people to sleep basically at any time, anywhere. This was an artist basically interested in doing an experiment that obviously was a kind of experiment. How to say? I would say it's a fake experiment. It's the idea of an experiment. But this is the experiment of Francesco Varela. He said to us that his idea of the laboratorium was, in fact, the place of the self, meaning that in a purest way, if we meditate and if we are in this meditative zone where we encounter ourselves, it could be called the first and the original laboratory, because a laboratory actually is a place of investigation, and this investigation of the self he considered very essential for communicating that in an exhibition through the world, in order for people to understand that they could all and have all some place of an essentially ethically also responsibility to engage with their own self as contributing to the world, to knowledge and things. So portable laboratory was the idea of Varela. Basically, this is a laboratory of doubt. Carsten Huller, who wanted to introduce the idea of doubt. I think you already mentioned it before too. People think there is no doubt involved in science and art, that people know what they do. But doubt is a very essential principle of the development of science and of experimentation. Probably all experimentation is a bit, a combination of doubt and knowing and trying. So he created this car to promote the idea of doubt, and so the car was standing outside of the exhibition and had no wheels, but on 2 times during the exhibition he put the wheels back onto the car and let it drive in circles around. And so basically this was like, I can't come to any conclusion. This he is a scientist, but he felt that this was very important to communicate this, because one of the most some of the most creative solutions to things come through doubt. Doubt is an essential process of leading to finding things, and so also for artists, a lot of doubt is involved in making art and being in the laboratory. We made reference, of course, also to James Lee Byers' the World Question Center, which happened in '69 in Brussels at the television station, where James Lee Byers wanted to ask the entire world, basically 100 people he called the most brightest minds at the time, to formulate to him the question they had in their mind. If we would know all the questions that people have today, we would know something about the future, because questions are the beginning of some investigation. So that was not the only artist. Karel André and many more other artists at the time considered the question a very essential modus of practice of investigation for art and for probably for any kind of critical work, I would say. So he created this World Question Center, where he called from the Belgium television station people around the world to just say a question. And it's one of the most wonderful experiments I think ever happened in the world of in art that also happened in Belgium. So we wanted to refer to that laboratorium. So I'm giving this, short introduction on this exhibition. This is the first laboratorium of Jan Fabre in the garden of his parents, which we also went to visit. This is Griegli, an artist that is deaf, who does research on language with people. And so this is Matt Mulleken. I'm not going to go in detail, but I think the most important thing to say for today, in order to lead to some discussion, is to say that at the time we were not interested. There had already been a lot of exhibitions on art and science, or science and art's relationship, to represent this relationship, or to have science be represented in an exhibition, because that is an aesthetics in which there was some kind of development already, and it kind of became an aesthetic in itself, art and science. And the things started to look very much as explanations one of the other. So there was no actually fusion going on, which was, I think, at the time our hope. We couldn't find that, but we found a way to investigate at a deeper level, or philosophical or also practical question, of how these conditions might be better understood in order to for them to meet. And why I think the more deeper important thing of this is, I think, is that the word has fallen already also, aesthetics. It's very often, I think, pretty misunderstood what aesthetics is. Aesthetics comes from the words of senses, to make people not only to see, of course you see through the senses, but it's also about the senses of making people sensible to things. And in this sense, the role of the artist, the role of the scientist works with facts and data and research. But if in the world we live, it is essential that all of us get sensitive about certain issues. So the role of the art, I would say the novelist or the artist can play an as important role in terms of making us sensitive to certain questions, be it ecological, for example, today, one of the major things. At the end of the day, they end up at the agenda of politicians to do something with this, to make a better future with it. But I think in that sense, artists and scientists are doing similar work in a democratic environment. And that, I think, is to me, the more important and interesting way to think of the relationship between scientists and artists as their common responsibility, and not as an aesthetic in terms of it looks like this or whatever, which is something where I think this whole category got stuck in for a long time in this so-called, yes, of course, it looks wonderfully beautiful to see an experiment somehow. It looks fantastic, and something similar is said of art too. But then we haven't know what we're actually talking about. And that, I think, is something that I put on the table for our discussion later. Thank you. And
all right, thank you both. So now I would like to invite you to have a discussion about the things we just talked about. I've got some other questions going as well. So picking up on what you were just saying, that common responsibility that you just mentioned. So how do you see that relating to art, science, and politics? What do you see that as that common responsibility towards society, I guess?
Well, I think we're in this for a long time already. From the 16th, the 17th, the 18th century, it's called democracy. It's been created then, and it's actually, the way I understand it, and some other thinkers also, it's the common project we all have together to make a future and how to organize it together. There are lots of actors involved in this game, and players needed to tell us, because it's a pretty chaotic environment we work in. It's the planet Earth, and it's now actually pretty also fucked up because of ecological problems and so on. So it's always been like that we need to find the actors to make this common project work. And I think there has been a time or a longer period when we saw separation between these things in a bigger way. like the artists do this, they make things that are beautiful. Maybe some people still think this, that it's only for decoration. But I believe that, as I mentioned before, they're all developing in a way, making us sensitive to certain issues that are our concern in this environment. And scientists have instruments, facts, and other machines for this. Artists have other means to do this. But it seems to me that it's all a common project in that sense. And I'm looking forward to an exhibition in the future about science and art that sees this as a common thing, because oftentimes, at least in the past, science and arts were kind of strange categories to meet in exhibitions. Like it looked like this is not art, and you are transforming the science because you're making it from an aesthetic point of view. You are taking the audience also quite as ignorant because you're not actually telling what it's about. You're just showing them. So I think there comes a time we need to see this in a broader context where this entire endeavor lies for me. That's my take on science and art, and I'm very happy to see that younger generation of curators are back into this question, because it was un peu démodé, as we said. People thought it was a bit, nothing much was to be said there. But I've always felt a big interest in it. Maybe because I studied philosophy, I have more this philosophical approach to this. But that's my, hope for science and art.
I agree with your stand of view. I think responsibility is a very big word. What is the responsibility of an artist and a scientist? I think our common, I don't want to use the word responsibility, but I think it's a process of activation, where we want to activate people to think and reflect on our common state of human beings and humankind. And where do we want to go to? Are we approaching the right direction? And come to or invite people through the work of artists, or the direction where we want to put knowledge creation through science in, to come to that kind of reflection. I think that's the common responsibility, through failure and doubt, and but it's coming to a common state of reflection. We don't have to share the same opinions, but it has to come through discussion. And exhibitions for me are the perfect medium to bring those different kind of perspectives together and to activate your visitors, to make them aware, and sensibilization through an exhibition is important. Not to give them answers, but to put these questions, I think that's also a very important word, on the table. Where are we at as human beings, as humankind, and where do we want to take it from here? I think,
I totally agree. You're right. Responsibility might be a bit of a too strong word, but no, it is really important that that we try to move forward together. In that sense, how do you see us doing that as artists and scientists together, or as art science, as we would call it? Because up until now, maybe art and science have been split apart in a certain sense, or have been represented differently. Or have been seen as opposites, when to me they aren't. I mean, I've always had the idea that art and science try to look for answers to the big questions in the universe, just in a different way. I just wonder, how do you see your role as curators in enabling that shared space to happen? How do you enable that as curators? How do you, how should I say that? How do you let that grow? I don't know.
It's a very difficult question, and it's the question that you continuously pose when you're curating, I think. And the four things that I named there, the scenography and that kind of, you have to make sure that the right setting is made to enable your visitor to come into that reflective state of mind. If you don't, and you know, if I'm talking about scientific exhibitions right now. When you enter those kind of exhibitions, I think a lot of visitors get the idea that there's some kind of truth being told to them, and that they just get some kind of data offered, like you're reading. Well, I would say newspaper, but because people think that they read the truth in newspapers. But what I think you have to make your exhibition space an experience where the visitor feels like you're not just approaching them as idiots who just have to open up their mouth and you will pour in all the... It's not just about learning the truth when you go to an exhibition or as a didactic tool, but it's... I think you're also allowed to be a little bit uncomfortable when you're in an exhibition, and a little bit shaken up. So by juxtaposing objects or disciplines or whatever you do, but this juxtaposition, I think, is a very strong tool to make people have the visitor make their own story and their own questions. So as a curator, it's not just sharing your own story, it's evoking something in the visitor, and that's your role, I think, as a curator.
Well, as a curator, you know, like, I'm not, it's a term that is not from, I mean, Hans Ulrich always thought we're more like catalysts, you know. Especially, I'm not curator of what is called essay exhibitions, where you lay out a subject. I'm more a curator working with living artists and trying to find out how we, through our curating, can bring forth some of the work they are doing, and we are kind of catalysts in between things often, rather than telling a narrative about... That's just a category of curating where I'm in, because I'm a so-called contemporary art curator of biennials, and we do a lot of production also. So in that sense, I think, I mean, I'm going to give an example. One of the very nice, beautiful examples I saw of science and art recently is, I want to tell this because it's really a marvelous project. It's called the Ocean Academy. You can see it now, or you can participate somehow in it at the Venice Biennale, but it's actually in London based. And they're catalyzing projects with artists about the ocean. The biggest place on this planet Earth is the ocean. And it's the most invisible place of all, because you know, you can of course dive in there, and some people go dive in there, and we see some pictures about it, but that's just a tiny fragment of something very huge happening now out there in the ocean, a threat to the ocean also. So they are working with artists all over the world, from Indonesia to everywhere, to go into the ocean and tell the stories of the ocean. And I saw this incredible, and I thought this was the most beautiful science and art project I've ever seen. Joan Jonas telling 3 hours an epic story of the ocean, about all the fishes and all these creatures out there. And she was basically kind of part of them, dancing with them. But this affective nature of her performance created, I think, the strongest affective connection we need now with this place, the ocean, in order to solve this problem for the ocean. And that was, for me, it's both, of course, a science and art project, but it's also a political project. It's a project that is bringing people together on the verge to do something about this. Not because they are, putting money, because they're effectively touched by it. That was, to me, the most beautiful science and art project that I recently saw. Well, anyway, I don't know how to do it, but I felt very inspired by seeing that. So I wanted to give that.
No, that sounds beautiful. And that's at the Venice Biennale right now. Yeah. Okay. Well, we should go and see that. No, that's very interesting. You're right. I guess part of what interested me mostly about art and science, I guess, is what you just mentioned, the fact that it touches you, the fact that it's something that's, and this is of course what we expect art to do, and this is of course what we expect good art to do anyway. But science does that as well, I find. It's in a very more subtle sense. But and this is maybe something for you, I think, as the experience that we get through science mostly is something that I find very touching as well, in the same way that art does. But it's not for everyone, but maybe that's something that science should look to more, or should try to cultivate more, because it would maybe bring it across to people more effectively. I don't know if that's if that's something that's I mean, it reminded me when you talked about the museum that's something that's very obvious to the things you're trying to do. So how does this, because you're working with experience more than you are with just output, but how do you usually see that experience as in relation to science and art? Like how does that start?
It's a question that I've been wondering for the past years. How do you bring that experience across? Not every science has that kind of woohoo, but I know what you mean. And I don't want to use the word wonder because it's so cliche. Everybody uses the word wonder, and I wanted to show that film of Sci-art, because for me, this kind of human quest to knowledge, to something to hang on to, it's something that unites us. It's very universal, very timeless. So that sense of timelessness and to connect with other human beings, for me, that's very embedded in the scientific process and scientific thinking. That's one. So to bring that across, for example, through a film installation, or that's one. Or the whale in the cathedral is a similar kind of thing. When I observed people watching the skeleton in the cathedral for the first time, they were really looking at it, not just seeing it, but looking at it, observing it, wondering what kind of bone that was. And if they walk through a natural history museum, they usually pass by the whale skeletons. They're not, but by putting it out of context, you make them experience how a scientist, when we dissect, also just discovered through dissection, through observation, questioning, and that kind of. So by putting that object out of context, they were actually practicing science by just looking at it, right? Or the first step of science. So bringing across that experience of the scientific process, I think, is through that kind of measures. I was thinking of another example, but yeah, that's mainly it. But so it's focusing, I think, for example, one of the things I didn't mention is that I in none of the exhibitions, of course in the permanent display of the science museum, that's another thing, but for example, in the cathedral or in the post-mortem, there were never any name tags next to the objects. So the fin whale skeleton, what would you expect? Some kind of a land map where the whale lives, where it reproduces, and then people just take in that kind of information and they don't look at it anymore. And I think they have to be able to observe and explore themselves before they find out, it's a fin whale. And that's the story behind the fin whale. So it's evoking that kind of scientific process, which is embedded in all of us, just by some small little measures that you take as a curator, I think. And then you experience science by yourself. And the confrontation, because when you experience standing underneath this fin whale skeleton, you also very easily, as a human being, go into a human stream of thoughts, like, it's probably our fault that it's dead, and it's probably which is very contra-scientific. So it's also a confrontation with your human way of thinking and why we need science to be able to come to knowledge creation. So it's that kind of play that I try to work on.
What to say else, but I think, yeah, I mean, there are all of these possibilities of methods of opening up the understanding and relationship of science and art. And personally, at this point in time, my biggest concern is also because I think science does a lot of very important things, and it's kind of a little bit overlooked in the process somehow. I mean, we know already, because of the scientists, more than 40 years that we were going to end up in this place with our ecological problems. They've been saying it so much. I mean, and there's, you know, a bigger need to engage in taking responsibility to do something about it. And as we, you know, see today even, that it's incredible to see how such a urgent problem doesn't get the effective response in order to actually take the actions that are needed. And I think artists can do a lot these days also in terms of helping. And I think it's what we see in the exhibitions we visit. I think the curators here who are studying here too, when you go to international exhibitions and see what the subjects and issues that are there in the works by the artists, then you can see that this concern is there. The only question is, I think what we also know is there is somehow a little bit fatigue going on also in the art world. Pamela M. Lee just wrote, we should forget about the art world, because unfortunately the art world itself is completely caught up in it. Any product that is made there is going to contribute to the globalization in the wrong way, in terms of the finances and money and everything involved. So we must really think deeper. I think you can't just make this a superficial illustrative problem anymore. We have this opportunity with art to create a bigger effective relationship to the serious issues of our world and our lives and our beings as human beings, but also our environment. But it's right now in a quite dangerous situation. And science and art maybe is always a good way to stay away from the other part of the art world. It's the economical, you know, I mean, it's hard to find galleries really interested in this subject, which is maybe a good thing. But that's something else I wanted to say. You have to be careful about the art world itself also. You have to be very, aware of what we work with. We can't just, we should be scientists at least of understanding the art world we work in also. It's one way of also thinking about it. We need a more responsible attitude and understanding of of what is going to happen to art if it continues like this in the market. It's something I'm saying because it's a potential there that is going to be missed.
No, you're very right. Actually, in a panel I was in, I think a couple of weeks ago, a theater producer I was talking to said, the art world is dead.
It's not, I think we have to be careful.
No, but I mean, what he meant was that it's, like you said, just so caught up in itself and not looking beyond its borders, which is very interesting to me because we always have this idea that art is open to everything. And like Marjan said earlier, that science is very rigid and that those are very opposite to each other, that art is open to whatever may come, but that science is very rigid, while I myself have found that it's not as different. Art is sometimes very rigid, and especially in the art world, I think. And I feel like science has been misrepresented as very rigid, because that's what we see. And it's what, I mean, the things we see from scientists are the discoveries, and are the scientists predict the ecological downfall and everything, but we don't see everything that comes before that. We don't see the the doubts that you need to get there.
Well, we didn't have to end so quickly with this, with investigation. I mean, maybe I think what you are doing at your museum, if I understand well, is still a possibility. It's an art exhibition, but it's outside of the so-called market of the exhibition art world, I think. So there is a difference, and there are still many places to do very important things. But yeah, I guess my practice has been more caught up into this, system of the art world, where these things are now changing in that way. And science and art. I mean, we have a lot of interesting artists working, like even Olafur Eliasson, or name so many, are working and with art, with scientists and so on. But in fact, the topic is not really on the table, I think, in the art world right now. I haven't seen it. I was asking you, but I mentioned this incredible project of the Ocean Academy, but it's an outside project. It's not in the art world. It's never been actually a major thing, except I think for Bruno Latour, who, I don't know if you know Bruno Latour, but he became a curator in our exhibition. It was the first time he did it, and he takes that responsibility very serious, to do exactly like you do, to communicate between the sciences and the artists, these things. I think he does a great job with all the exhibitions he's doing, but it's not really on the agenda of the art world, unfortunately, I think.
No, you're right.
You know, when you previously asked what our role as curators is, what I often find myself, I'm some kind of translator between scientists and artists. Because you're exactly right. People often think that the dialogue doesn't work because scientists don't want to collaborate with the artists, but there are a lot of artists who don't want to collaborate with the scientists either, because they think that the scientists are too rigid and too... and they speak a different language, and they speak next to each other, and it's sometimes one big clusterfuck of communication when you put them together. And I think our role as curators is often translating what one says to the other and how they can find each other. But they have to be willing. And I think you're exactly right that the art world has become too closed off, but the scientific world as well. So our role as curators should be opening up and build bridges, I think, both worlds.
Definitely, and I mean, this is why we're here, I guess. No, of course, what I meant when I said the art world is dead, it's a provocation, of course. I mean, it's not dead, but it's an issue.
But there are these historical examples, of course. CERN, before, at the very first day they opened the laboratory, they invited artists. The program with artists started there already in the 60s, 69, I think. Same was with art and technology at MoCA in San Francisco. From the very beginning in 68, they spread out artists all over the country, the United States, to work in laboratories. Not only laboratories, also think tanks and research groups were all hosting artists to collaborate with them. And it was a very important moment at the time. It's just one of my other researches, and I'm going to bring this up because it's also art and science. There was this moment, it was in the 50s, the group called New Tendencies, completely lost. 350 artists were in this. These were really artists at the edge of science and data, computer and art. They were seeing that cross then. In 68, that movement was completely killed. There's now a new interest back into this. But somehow in the art world, because of the problem of misunderstanding the concept of aestheticization, it always drops to nothing. What happened with these people were interested in is what is called seeing. Probably one of the most important things of art is to see. But seeing is not something that happens in the body alone. There are interest in biology. Seeing as an operation that happens outside of the body. It was called liquid seeing. If you see all this optic art, you know, when you see certain things, it's not happening, the image making is not happening in the body, but outside of the body. This was extremely important for our situation today, to continue that investigation. Because today the concept of liquid seeing and seeing happening everywhere and our interference with seeing in the virtual reality and all of these things are very important. And it died off. Somehow each time in the art world, if there is, actually I must give this to you, in the United States it's Pamela M. Lee, there are a lot of interesting cross-disciplinary art historical research happening to look back at these moments in history when science and art met somehow at very fundamental, in very fundamental ways, and somehow it always got cornered down in the corner of art history as uninteresting. Optic art ended in '65 with an exhibition at the MoMA called The Experience of the Eye. And it ended because the directors and the curators turned all this beautiful optic art into tapestry and t-shirts, and all stuff of style, of aesthetics came out. And the other artists said, oh, that's not what we want for art to happen. They saw something more profound for art, so they stopped it. But a lot of very important things happened there. And this is what I mean with why the art world has a difficulty sometimes of leading it, although we see many interesting historical occurrences of it, actually.
Yeah, go ahead, and I'll repeat your question.
Really in relation to art and technology, the lifetime of experiments. I'm just wondering both of you, the three of you could respond to this. It feels art and science is itself a kind of romantic notion, perpetuating a binary, kind of visualization or experimentation like we showed in the film. But in fact, true threat, you could say, was probably technology, how technology interfaces with science. And going to Cell recently was just an experiment in the unseeing of the blindness of technology in the face of science. So I'm just wondering if we're not even walking up the wrong tree with art and science, and should be really focusing on technology, and how technology is invisibilizing a lot of what we held to be science, which now I could just data. There's a certain sense in, you mentioned how you have the dynamics of an exhibition or the presentation, but the mere fact of presenting something as stable as quote unquote permanent display seems to somehow find the face of this acceleration of technology, leaving science behind in the cabinets and the object.
Was that a question or? Well, I think the value of something that is tangible will always remain for me. And maybe I speak too much for myself. Is that your question? To make everything virtual and to for me that question lies in the same kind of questions like do we still need books, or are we just going to use e-readers, and that kind of question. For me, the tangible thing where people come together like an exhibition space will always have its value. That's my opinion, but maybe I'm not directly answering your question.
If I understood you correctly, maybe it was more about how art science is in itself sort of a poetic thing, and we should focus more on how technology is impacting art and science. Is that what you meant? Yeah. Right. Yeah, how technology could be the link between the two. Yeah. Well, I mean, certainly yes. I mean, obviously technology is something we can't ignore because, I mean, we use it as a tool. But I mean, as you mentioned, that a lot of the science has now become data and is not sort of a tangible thing anymore. But I do think that in some sense, science has always been not a tangible thing. I mean, in the deep sense of what science is. I mean, it's something that happens up here, as with art. And in a sense, everything that we use to do experiments, to prove things, to show what we mean in an artwork, or to bring out that idea of what we are trying to create, is in a sense, a tool, and I mean, in that sense, I think technology is a useful tool, yes, but I don't know if it's the only bridge or if it's the bridge that we need. I think both art and science are things that we create up here in our mind. But I don't know, maybe that's just me.
Yeah, I agree. We create it in our minds. It's our understanding of the world that basically is the material we work with. But however, if you have it in an exhibition, or if you have it in a context where you can experience it, it can help for people who maybe not have, for example, the deeper understanding of what does it mean two particles colliding, to have some understanding of it. And it's necessary. It's the same thing that Bruno Latour did with his theater of proof. Why did Pasteur have to prove to a lay audience what a bacteria was? It was essential for the whole process of hygiene and investing in this and so forth. It was so essential for everybody. And I think that's where this translation, whether he does it in a presentation like Theater of Proof, or scientists do it like this all the time. They present their findings all the time in public. And when they want to show why it's important to investigate the collision of two planets, which something probably never was going to happen, but they need to understand it, then they have to come and show this to you, something you cannot see, And that's exactly this moment of translation that the scientists do themselves too. It's not a moment of translation, it's making it sensible to you. It's making you understand this thing. And that can go through the senses. And that's why it's called aesthetic. But politics is aesthetic too in the same way. It's not only the colors and the beauty of the form, it's making you sensible to something. And that's why it is very important, I think. And the relationship between the scientist and the artist is one where maybe this can help. I'm sure it does, because now if I'm visiting, even taking the last Venice Biennale, you see all of these subjects out there. They're in the artworks, so people are busy with it. But I think many people, even me, myself as a curator, and many curators say, but what can art do about it? What can we do about changing this? What can we do in terms of ecological thing? It needs to be translated into a political situation in order to change and take action, to do things. But we all play a role in it. As I said from the beginning, we're all actors in this bigger organization. And I think it's very important. Science and art, somewhere, they're doing something essential, because as it's so complex now where science is today. What they already understand of this very complex universe is amazing. Nobody can understand this. I mean, even scientists don't understand each other when they talk from one discipline to another. I mean, they're all... So we need to find moments of translation, I think, still for us to understand all of this.
Was that what Leo Apostle was all about?
You're right. That was what the Apostle was all about. Yeah, finding the common language, and maybe that's the thread today. That finding the common language is the thing we should look for. And I mean, you're right. Technology is. I mean, we do need that. We do need that sense of translation. We do need to be able to show what we mean. Or
yeah, we need to be able to experience it. That's why you focus on experience too. Like if you would have told somebody, I don't know what, 30 years ago that what the internet was and how that was going to affect our lives, nobody would have believed you really. But once you're in it and you experience this, you know what this thing is. We have some idea of what the internet is because we're affected by it. We experienced it. And so now this is already there, but there's so many more things coming on off to us that we need to understand in a similar deep way. And that goes through affect also, I think.
Are we... Yeah, of course, go ahead.
Some other ideas, because there's a sense that you guys are seeing technology or something divided, but your own body is a technology. The biological technology aspect of your body makes it impossible for art to be something other than a biological, but there's a consciousness behind it, but I think there's much more connected and divided in all those things, and there's a the exploration of what it is to be alive happens in a material world, and it's also a biological thing. So it's all these things connected is this search of trying to understand where are you as a conscious, as trying to understand it. But and when you were talking about something, but I thought your question was more about the divide, that technology was something a problematic aspect, right, or something like that, or?
Yeah, maybe we misunderstood. I'm sorry.
No, I'm just thinking that it is an answer to Barbara that science, maybe technology leads to the politicization of technology is the politicization of science. I mean, science is just an
What do you mean? But I think that yes, but I'm just gonna go further on your thing because I think there's a big aspect that we are not going, and you were even like, oh, don't go into that side, but it's the economics. It's the economics in art, it's the economics in science. It creates the big gap between understanding science and using and living in a world of science, or where your data is used for a lot of things, but you cannot understand because our systems, our political systems, are still following a very strange and wrong path economically that will end with our lives in this planet if we keep following it. So art should get together with science, economical scientists, and give it a blow on the economics that we are living in now. That would enable us to invest in education so people can understand more about science, so people can explore. And
ask you a question.
my question is a critique, and why are you guys focusing on the economics of all this? Is the root of so many of these problems that we are living right now.
No, you're right. The fact that we're not focusing on it right now doesn't mean it's not the root of all the problems. We were just going up to what we were trying to discuss today in the limited time that we have. But you're right.
But I think you kind of misunderstand me if I said exactly the same thing. The way economic logics operate in the world of art is what is endangering the world of art. We have a problem with... Also in science, I didn't mention it, but it happens all the time in science too. We know that scientists are completely under pressure by other economical logics behind what their findings might bring. So we know that, and that's why I'm speaking from the art world, just from this, and just said this is probably the bigger problem we have in the art world is the economics of it. I think we agree.
I think that's why one of the key messages was the fact that science is in constant dialogue with society, and that, yes, society and the present culture influences the focuses of science. That's why I said today we're all focusing on medicine, on research on cancer, but maybe there are more people dying of other diseases. So yes, there's an economical influence, and it's important that we make our visitors aware of it. Otherwise they don't. So we're again to the sensibilization and our role as curators to make people aware and think about these things, yeah?
Yeah, and not just that. I mean, when you go to a more global scale, as you said, obviously there's issues in art and science. Definitely, when it comes to funding on both sides, when it comes to performance linked to funding, the way we valorize things, the way we valorize art, the way we valorize science, I mean, has also progressed throughout the ages, but is definitely not in a good place right now. And that is all linked, of course, and we should do something about that. And we should all do something about that. But how do we? That's one of the big questions that I put to you this time. How do we?
And one of my answers was try to make this visible in a moment like this.
No, you're very right.
When you get these opportunities to point problems or point like issues or things, or
No, you're very right.
We still have to tackle this big issue.
Yeah. Just that way in return, slightly the idea of a permanent, and what I appreciate that Mohamed is that it resisted any form of permanence. It was kind of tackling impermanence at every level, the catalog or even the propositions made, which were changing every day. But when Marjan is faced with the idea of doing something that's very expensive, very ambitious, how to kind of embed the idea that in 20 years we might not even be able to screen. It's so critical, the situation that we're in ecologically, that it might not matter in a way. I'm just thinking, what kind of sense of urgency really drives the idea of a permanent display for pedagogical use? How can we really...
So I will answer that with the same. How do I approach all the faculty boards? Permanent display is a misconception. The permanent display in a museum has roughly the life lost. How do you say that? It lasts like 7 years to 10 years. Eh? It's not. I mean, not. Yeah, that's about it. And then you. Yeah, exactly. So in 7 years, well, I hope you don't swim by that time, but. The notion that a lot of, so to make that permanent display as flexible as possible, is that what you, yeah, so that's a big issue, to make the permanent display as flexible as possible, where you can change objects, or you can let artists do interventions in the permanent display. That's one way of trying to shake things up a bit, but yeah, that's, it's a concern. But I also hope to change the permanent display in, let's say, maybe 10 years, if finances allow. But not in 15 to 20 years, then it's just sad. Seeing a permanent display that lasts 20 years is just, yeah, no.
Is even 10 years not a bit long?
10 years is a bit long, but it costs a lot of money, I see. If we can change it in 7 years. Yeah, so for one, I see artistic interventions, but also that's one of the reasons why we also made the cabinets. So our main narrative is on these tables, where we have very carefully chosen those 8 objects per team. But in the cabinets, we're allowed more flexibility, and we can change more easily the teams that make sidewalks, or that, yeah. So that's one of the reasons why we chose those cabinet installations. Yeah.
Okay, I think we'll end it here, as our time has run out. Thank you all for coming, and thank you, Marjan and Barbara, for the interesting talk. And we hope to see you all again on the next one. It's the 7th of June, I think. So yeah, thank you, everyone.